On a quiet Thursday morning, a single interview broadcast to millions signaled a fundamental shift in the geometry of North American power. Donald Trump's assertion that the United States would initiate ground operations against Mexican drug cartels wasn't merely a campaign promise. It was the public articulation of a structural inevitability. For decades, the border between the United States and Mexico has been managed through the lens of trade and diplomacy, but the system is now undergoing a phase transition. When a superpower perceives that its neighbor has lost the Weberian monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force, the existing diplomatic architecture begins to crack. The cartels are no longer viewed as criminal gangs, but as non-state armed actors capable of projecting power across a porous 2,000-mile frontier. This is the threshold where sovereignty ends and kinetic necessity begins, a point where traditional rules of engagement are discarded in favor of systemic survival. The implications of such a move extend far beyond tactical strikes. We are witnessing the birth of a new doctrine, one that treats the Mexican landmass not as a sovereign partner, but as a compromised security perimeter. Donald Trump's rhetoric regarding the capture of Nicolas Maduro serves as a blueprint for what is being proposed. It is a logic of special sovereign intervention, where the defense of human capital, threatened by the 300,000 annual deaths attributed to synthetic opioids, supersedes the traditional respect for national borders. This investigation will demonstrate that the war on drugs has evolved into a war for the perimeter, where the goal is the absolute control over critical nodes of North American logistics and the forced decoupling of the continent from external rivals. Before we dissect the mechanics of this tectonic shift, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. This channel operates on the principle of looking beneath the political noise to find the structural gears that move our world, and your support allows us to produce these long-form investigations. Ensure you watch this entire video until the very end. By the final section, we will reveal how this proposed military expansion isn't just about security, but is the final piece in a global chess move to reclaim control over strategic ports that have fallen under the influence of America's primary global competitor. The inevitability of this friction is encoded in the data. We're not just discussing a policy shift. We're discussing the redesign of the Western Hemisphere. The structural engine of this entire movement is the legal weaponization of the Foreign Terrorist Organization, or FTO, designation. By reclassifying Mexican cartels from criminal syndicates to terrorist entities, the U.S. executive branch unlocks systemic tools that bypass traditional bilateral agreements. This is the terrorist paradigm, a framework where the rules of the FBI and the DEA are replaced by the rules of the Department of Defense. In this scenario, a cartel laboratory in a Mexican state is no longer a matter for local police, but a target for the same kinetic machinery used in global counterterrorism. Donald Trump is signaling a move toward a post-Westphalian reality, where a state's failure to secure its own territory grants its neighbor the right to perform security maintenance as an act of self-defense. This framework is not an emotional reaction. It is a calculated response to the erosion of the American workforce. When systemic pressure reaches a critical mass, the political cost of inaction becomes higher than the diplomatic cost of intervention. The thesis we are exploring is that the threat to Mexico is actually a multi-layered lever. It is a tool designed to force the Mexican government to choose between direct U.S. military presence or a total, unconditional realignment with Washington's economic and security priorities. The drug trade is the visible catalyst, but the invisible objective is the reclamation of the North American manufacturing corridor and the total securitization of every port, rail line, and highway that connects the two nations. To understand the structural inevitability of Donald Trump's rhetoric, one must look back to 1916, when the United States last ignored Mexican sovereignty to pursue a non-state actor. The punitive expedition, led by General John J. Pershing, was the response to Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. At the time, the Mexican state was fractured unable to control its own revolutionary factions. This lack of a monopoly on violence forced Washington to extend its security perimeter deep into Mexican territory. Today, the cartels occupy a similar structural vacuum. They are not mere gangs. They are paramilitary entities with their own intelligence networks, logistics, and social control. The precedent of 1916 proves that when a neighboring state cannot or will not suppress a threat that spills over the border, the United States will prioritize its own national security over international protocol. The parallels are striking. Just as Villa's forces utilized the rugged terrain of Chihuahua to evade capture, modern cartels use the complex urban and mountain infrastructure of Sinaloa and Michoacán. However, the scale today is exponentially larger. Pershing moved with 10,000 troops. Today's proposed intervention would involve drone swarms, signals intelligence, and elite special operations forces targeting high-value narco-terrorists in a surgical capacity. Donald Trump's praise for the military operation that captured Nicolas Maduro is the modern evolution of the Pershing Doctrine, a demonstration that borders are increasingly seen as liquid when high-value targets are involved. The mechanism of the 1916 expedition failed to capture Villa, but it succeeded in demonstrating that the U.S. military is willing to operate on foreign soil regardless of the host nation's consent if the domestic political pressure becomes unbearable. In the current context, the Pancho Villa is the fentanyl manufacturing hub. The 300,000 casualties mentioned by Donald Trump serve as the modern-day Columbus raid. It is the moral and political justification for a kinetic entry. The data suggests that the U.S. is preparing for a high-tech punitive expedition, utilizing the same justification used a century ago, that the Mexican government has ceded control of its territory to hostile actors. This is not a radical new idea. It is a return to a historical baseline where the superpower maintains order in its backyard by force when the local government fails to do so. The structural pressure for this intervention is built into the geography of the continent itself. The hidden cause behind the cartel protocol is not just the drug trade. It is the presence of China on the North American doorstep. Over the last decade, Mexico has become a critical node for Chinese economic expansion. Billions of dollars in foreign direct investment, FDI, have flowed from Beijing into Mexican manufacturing hubs and, most crucially, into its maritime infrastructure. The ports of Lázaro Cárdenas and Manzanillo have become the primary entry points for chemical precursors, but they also represent a strategic foothold for America's greatest global rival. When Donald Trump speaks of cartels controlling Mexico, he is also speaking of a Mexico that has become increasingly dependent on Chinese supply chains. From a U.S. perspective, this is a dual threat: a public health crisis caused by fentanyl and a geopolitical crisis caused by the loss of economic hegemony. The logistics are devastatingly efficient. Precursor chemicals are shipped from Asia, arrive at Mexican ports under the guise of legitimate industrial supplies, and are then processed in clandestine labs that operate with the efficiency of Fortune 500 factories. This is the China-Mexico bridge. By labeling the cartels as terrorists, Washington gains the legal leverage to demand oversight or direct control of these ports. The threat of a ground operation is the ultimate negotiation tool. It signals to the Mexican government that if they cannot decouple their logistics from Chinese illicit flows, the U.S. military will do it for them. This is the securitization of trade. Every shipping container that moves through Manzanillo is now viewed through the lens of national survival. Furthermore, the nearshoring trend, where U.S. companies move factories from China to Mexico, requires a secure environment. If the cartels control the highways and the ports, the nearshoring dream becomes a nightmare. Donald Trump's interventionist stance is a way to guarantee the safety of this new industrial base. It is an imperial security tax. If Mexico wants the economic benefits of being America's factory, it must accept the American security umbrella, even if that umbrella involves boots on the ground and drones in the air. The goal is to create a sanitized corridor where Chinese influence is purged and American logistics are absolute. The 300,000 annual deaths are the catalyst, but the total control of the North American trade perimeter is the prize. To justify a ground operation, one must first demonstrate that the host state has failed in its primary duty, the protection of its citizens and the control of its territory. In the investigative framework of this script, we analyze the infrastructure of state failure. This isn't about the absence of a government, but the presence of a shadow state. In many regions of Mexico, the cartels have built a parallel infrastructure. They collect taxes, extortion, they provide social services, and they maintain their own judicial systems through violence. This is what Donald Trump refers to when he says the cartels are controlling Mexico. From a structural standpoint, Mexico is operating under a dual sovereignty model, where the official government in Mexico City shares power with regional warlords. This dual sovereignty is a direct threat to the U.S. because the shadow state is incentivized by the illicit trade that is killing American citizens. The technical term for this is malign actor penetration. When cartel members utilize Barrett .50 caliber rifles and armored vehicles to defeat the Mexican National Guard in open combat, as seen in the infamous Culiacanazo, it proves to Washington that the Mexican military is no longer sufficient to contain the threat. The structural implication is clear. If the Mexican military cannot defeat the cartels, the U.S. military must. This is the cold logic of the security gap. Every time a cartel convoy moves freely through a Mexican state, the case for U.S. intervention grows stronger in the halls of power in D.C. This section breaks down the specific technical failures, the corruption of the judiciary, the infiltration of local police forces, and the inability to secure the plazas, the strategic smuggling corridors. We're not just looking at crime. We're looking at a systemic collapse of the border as a barrier. If the cartels can move 250,000 fentanyl pills in a single shipment with near-zero probability of interception, the border has ceased to exist as a functional security tool. Donald Trump's rhetoric is the political recognition of this technical reality. He is stating that the fence is broken because the neighbor is no longer in charge of his own house. Therefore, the only solution is for the United States to step across the line and rebuild the infrastructure of control itself. The roadmap for Donald Trump's strategy toward Mexico can be found in the recent history of U.S.-Venezuela relations. The playbook is identical. Identify a hostile or non-compliant regime. Label its primary economic or power structures as narco-terrorist, and use that designation to justify extreme measures of kinetic enforcement. In the case of Nicolás Maduro, the U.S. didn't just use sanctions. It issued bounties and praised surgical operations to dismantle the leadership's grip on power. Donald Trump's public admiration for the fantastic group that captured Maduro is not just a compliment to the military. It is a signal of intent. He is suggesting that the same regime change or high-value target logic can be applied to any territory where the local government fails to align with Washington's security mandates. By calling the cartels the controllers of Mexico, Trump is effectively delegitimizing the Mexican state in the same way the Maduro administration was delegitimized. When a government is framed as a puppet or a victim of criminal organizations, it loses its sovereign immunity in the eyes of U.S. hawks. This allows for the normalization of military incursions. The Venezuelan precedent shows that once the narco-state label is applied, the U.S. shifts from a policy of cooperation to a policy of extraction and replacement. In Mexico, this doesn't necessarily mean removing the president, but it does mean removing the Mexican government's exclusive authority over its ports, its borders, and its internal security. The Venezuelan case was a laboratory for this doctrine. It proved that the U.S. could successfully target the leaders of a foreign nation by framing them as common criminals rather than political figures. By praising the elimination of Cuban soldiers in the Venezuelan operation, Trump is also highlighting a zero-tolerance policy for foreign intervention in the hemisphere. This is a direct warning regarding the Chinese presence in Mexico. If the Mexican government cannot expel the biological threat of fentanyl and the geopolitical threat of Chinese influence, The U.S. will treat the situation as a military vacuum that must be filled. The blueprint is clear: isolate, designate, and intervene. If the order is given to initiate ground operations against the cartels, the world will not see a traditional 20th century invasion. Instead, we will witness the deployment of the Kinetic Architecture, a high-tech, decentralized form of warfare designed for special sovereign intervention. This architecture relies on the total dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum and the use of loitering munitions, or kamikaze drones. Donald Trump's vision of military action involves bypassing the slow-moving Mexican bureaucracy to strike directly at the heart of cartel logistics. We're talking about the kill chain being reduced from hours to minutes. Using high-altitude surveillance and signals intelligence, SIGINT, the U.S. can identify a fentanyl processing lab in the mountains of Sinaloa and neutralize it with a precision strike before the local authorities even receive a report. The operational detail here is crucial. Ground operations would likely take the form of deep penetration raids conducted by Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. These units wouldn't occupy cities. They would seize critical infrastructure points. This includes the control of specific bridges, rail crossings, and port terminals. By controlling the physical gateway between Mexico and the world, the U.S. military effectively becomes the customs agent of the continent. The goal is to create security bubbles around American-owned factories and logistics hubs, ensuring that the $1.6 trillion in annual trade continues to flow without being taxed by cartel derecho de piso. This is the technical reality of Operation Ground Force. It is the securitization of the supply chain through superior technology. The U.S. would utilize electronic warfare to jam cartel communications, rendering their paramilitary squads blind and deaf. This isn't just about killing drug lords. It's about dismantling the industrial base of the cartels. By destroying the chemical synthesis reactors and seizing the precursor storage tanks at the ports, the U.S. targets the cost of production. If the cartels cannot produce or ship their product reliably, their shadow state collapses from the bottom up. Donald Trump is betting that American technology can solve a problem that Mexican diplomacy has failed to address for half a century. The ultimate manifestation of this threat is the potential takeover of Mexico's maritime gateways. The Port Authority Mandate is the strategic endgame where the U.S. military or a U.S.-led task force assumes control of the ports of Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas. In the investigative logic of this script, these ports are the front lines of the fentanyl war. Currently, these ports operate under a veil of corruption and complexity that allows Chinese precursors to vanish into the Mexican interior. A U.S. ground operation would likely begin with the establishment of military inspection zones at these ports. This is where the threat to Mexico becomes a concrete reality: the loss of control over its most valuable economic assets. This move would serve a dual purpose. First, it halts the flow of chemicals used to produce fentanyl, directly addressing the 300,000 deaths mentioned by Donald Trump. Second, it serves as a hard stop to Chinese economic influence in North America. If the U.S. controls the ports, it controls who Mexico trades with. It is a return to the Monroe Doctrine, updated for the era of global shipping and synthetic drugs. By physically occupying or monitoring these nodes, Washington ensures that no Belt and Road infrastructure can take root. The ports become the filters for the entire continent, allowing only sanitized trade to pass through. The structural inevitability of this move is driven by the logic of the choke point. In any conflict, he who controls the choke point controls the system. Mexico's ports are the choke points of the fentanyl trade and the entry points for Chinese capital. Therefore, they're the primary targets of any U.S. intervention. Donald Trump's rhetoric about cartels controlling the country provides the necessary legal cover to liberate these ports from criminal influence. In reality, it is a transfer of control from a failing local authority to a dominant regional superpower. This is the final step in the reclamation of the North American perimeter. The synthesis of the cartel protocol reveals a transition from a continent of independent nations to an integrated security perimeter. This is the ultimate systemic outcome of the pressures we have analyzed. When Donald Trump describes the cartels as controlling Mexico, he is identifying a point of failure that the U.S. system can no longer tolerate due to its own internal fragility, specifically the erosion of its labor force by synthetic opioids and the strategic threat of Chinese nearshoring infiltration. The result is a forced evolution of the North American Treaty. The border is no longer a line on a map. It is being redesigned as a filter where every gram of precursor, every dollar of investment, and every unit of human capital is subjected to a singular U.S.-led security standard. This is the integration of sovereignty through the mechanism of crisis. In this new framework, the $1.6 trillion in annual trade acts as the gravity that keeps Mexico within the U.S. orbit, while the threat of ground operations acts as the containment field. We are seeing the end of the Mexican neutrality era. Structurally, the United States is signaling that it will no longer allow a gray zone on its southern flank. If the Mexican state cannot provide a clean environment for the relocation of global supply chains from Asia, the U.S. military-industrial complex will intervene to manufacture that stability. The 300,000 annual casualties are the moral fuel for this engine, providing the domestic political mandate for Donald Trump to execute a doctrine that effectively treats Mexico as a high-security industrial park. This synthesis proves that the threats are not isolated events, but parts of a singular geopolitical kill chain. The designation of cartels as terrorists leads to the legal right to intervene. The intervention leads to the control of ports. The control of ports leads to the exclusion of China, and the exclusion of China secures the North American manufacturing monopoly for the next century. It is a domino effect where the first tile was tipped by the first grain of fentanyl that crossed the border. The inevitability of this system is not based on malice, but on the cold, mathematical necessity of a superpower protecting its vital interests in a deglobalizing world. The era of managing the U.S.-Mexico relationship through traditional diplomacy is reaching its structural limit. As we have seen, the rhetoric used by Donald Trump is the surface-level expression of a much deeper tectonic shift. The 300,000 lives lost annually to fentanyl have created a political pressure cooker that requires a kinetic outlet. Whether through direct ground operations, the seizure of strategic ports, or the total reclassification of Mexican sovereignty under the terrorist paradigm, the outcome remains the same. The United States is reclaiming its perimeter. This is the cold reality of power. When a neighbor's internal instability threatens the core stability of a superpower, the border becomes a variable, not a constant. The Venezuela Blueprint and the ghost of General Pershing are not just historical curiosities. They're the functional operating manuals for the next decade of North American history. We are not explaining what might happen. We are explaining why systems always behave this way. The intersection of a public health catastrophe, a global trade war with China, and the rise of paramilitary shadow states in Mexico makes this friction inevitable. The mechanism of special sovereign intervention is now part of the North American toolkit. As the U.S. continues to decouple from global dependencies, the security of its immediate geography becomes its highest priority. Mexico stands at a crossroads, either a voluntary and total alignment with the U.S. security apparatus or a forced integration through the exercise of military and economic power. The data is clear, the precedents are set, and the architecture of intervention is already in place. Thank you for following this investigation into the structural gears of the North American perimeter. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel and like this video to support our work in uncovering the systems that move the world. Your engagement is what allows us to produce these deep dive reports. We will continue to monitor these structural shifts as they unfold across the globe. See you in the next video.